when you look at the data more closely, it is the household income growth that was very, very fast, much faster than the 1990s, much faster than today. So essentially, you have personal income growth exceeding the GDP growth, even though GDP growth was at a very high level. And then you look at India in the 1990s. I would argue that India pursued economic reforms. That's a very well-known story. The finance minister that started the reforms today is the prime minister. Most people talk about India in terms of the economic reforms that the country implemented. But you can make a case that the country also undertook political reforms. In 1997, some of the states passed the Freedom of Information Act, and then at the federal level, at the union level, they began to liberalize the information controls. And there are Indian scholars that I respect who argue that the governance in India, the quality of governance in India deteriorated. I think Divish probably has that view, and Arvind Subramanian has that view. Arvind sent me a paper, and I read the paper. I think from his paper, the indicators are at least mixed. There are some indicators that deteriorated. There are other indicators that actually improved. One measure that he had is the smuggling. Smuggling clearly declined. I mean, just the difference between night and day between the 1990s and 1980s. So I defer to the people who know more than I do about Indian political system, but at least you can make an argument that there are improvements in the Indian political system. The village governance, I thought they were fairly respectable, impressive reforms in the 1990s. The self-rule to the villages. So I think if we are not looking at the level, but we're looking at the direction, both countries shows that they produce faster GDP growth when the countries are moving toward more liberal direction, not necessarily the level, right? So China didn't reach a democratic level. India probably didn't reach a well-governed democratic level. And so let me talk about just a few minutes to talk about the economy. Again, this is from a very broad and macro perspective. One argument for one-party system is that you have a system that is able to build airports, right? Roads and airports. It is very interesting that a lot of the American observers of China and of India base their observations of the two countries on the basis of their airport experience. Thomas Friedman, all these people. I mean, in many ways, it's actually a very clever way of doing research because you have to pass through airport, right? So, so in my book, I'm working on, I call them airportology, right? So there's a whole cottage industry of airport studies, and these airportologists focus on just how grand the greeting hall is and things like that. So, there's some legitimacy with that view, in part because it saves the research costs. You don't have to go to the countryside, and I gradually learned, as a scholar, maybe we should follow that lead and come out with the views more quickly. But on the other hand, if you look at, again, a little bit beyond the grand statement, I would argue that China has better infrastructures than India, not because of the one-party system, but because it has had more years of economic growth and success. Right? So this is a critical issue, right? Do infrastructures serve as the cause of economic growth, or do they serve as a result of economic growth? These are two completely different views of infrastructures. If you believe that Indian entrepreneurs and Chinese entrepreneurs wait around, do nothing, play mahjong or the Indian equivalent of mahjong because there's no airport, yes, definitely you build infrastructures to facilitate growth. But if you believe in the view, which I believe, which I also see on the ground, Indian and Chinese entrepreneurs are very smart. They figure out solutions to solve these problems, and they have the hunger, they have the education, they have the human capital to launch business ventures without highways and those things, then the highways and the airports are really a result of economic growth. My prediction is that India is going to have its infrastructures once the country has had a number of years of economic growth, and you don't really need to have one-party authoritarian system and to do that. The reason why people have this view that you need infrastructures to kickstart growth, I think the reason is that they are based on wrong data. If you check the World Bank data on per capita GDP of India and China, the data will tell you that the two countries started at exactly the same level of per capita GDP, adjusted for purchasing power parity in 1990 or 1991, right? And then the two countries diverged. India grew, but much more slowly. China grew very, very fast. By the end of the 1990s, Chinese per capita GDP was almost double of the Indian per capita GDP. And people say, look, what did China do in the 1990s? Build infrastructures and things like that. The problem with that World Bank data is that one minor problem is that they are wrong. And so that and there have been alternative estimates of the Chinese GDP. And mostly the problem is with the Chinese data, not with the Indian data. And those alternative, Dwight Perkins and others will tell you that China's per capita GDP was much higher than Indian per capita GDP long before 1990. In fact, if you check the Human Development Index, China had better Human Development Index as compared with India as far away as 1975. Then we really need to think about not infrastructures, right? We need to think about the other things that preceded the growing divergence between these two countries. There, I will criticize India for massively failing to do the thing that really, really put China on a very substantial growth path, which has to do with education, basic education. And India, for some reason, couldn't get its act together to improve basic education. And now they are trying to catch up. It's a much more difficult task for them to catch up, given that you have basically a 30, 40-year lag vis-a-vis China. So I gave them a lot of credit for trying, but it is very, very difficult to do. So my worry about India is that they are learning, in part from Thomas Friedman and people like that, who are very impressed with highways, even though he tend to criticize the U.S. Use of cars in this country. I think the Indians are learning the wrong things from these American observers. They put too much emphasis on airports and highways. And I gave them credit for doing some of the things they are doing to improve basic education. But to truly get the Chinese growth growing, they really need to do much, much more. And I don't see the evidence at this point. Thank you.